Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Digital Shadows. Today's episode, Entering the Feed, Digital Ethnography and the Rise of the Online Far Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Digital Shadows. My name is Mark Smith, and I'll be your host. I am a student ethnographer training in anthropological fieldwork methods, and this semester I decided to focus on digital cultures, internet ethnography, netnography, and the ever-evolving and growing world of the online far right. Just to let you know, I am a graduate student in the Anthropology Department at the University of Colorado, Denver. And this podcast was created as part of an ethnographic project for my Fieldwork Methods class, which I took in the spring of 2025. In this podcast, we are going to enter the feed and examine how ethnographic methods help us understand the resurgence of neo-Nazism and the far right and their ideologies in online spaces like Reddit, 4chan, with an ultimate focus on Elon Musk's social media platform, X. Part 1. Internet Ethnography, From Villages to Feeds. So, traditionally, anthropologists went into the field physically and immersed themselves in communities through participant observation. But what happens when the field isn't a village, but a Reddit thread or a 4chan board or an algorithmically focused and curated timeline? Well, that's where digital ethnography comes in. And it's an approach where we adapt fieldwork to online spaces. Here, methods like netnography, a term coined by Robert Kozinets, author of Netnography, Doing Ethnographic Research Online, allows us to study online communities, cultures, and subcultures as legitimate field sites. Part 2, Participant Observation in Online Spaces. So, online participant observation looks different when doing this type of ethnography. You're lurking in threads, you're joining Discord servers, maybe even interacting as a participant by commenting on threads or sharing posts. Ethical concerns definitely abound. I'm an African-American researcher, and I was going into white supremacist spaces. So in order to protect myself, I use anonymity, just for researcher safety. So that made informed consent an impossibility, and that also brings in some ethical concerns that I'm an anonymous researcher that's not able to get informed consent from the people that I am observing. So in far-right spaces, researchers often have to adopt a non-interventionist approach. You observe, but you don't engage. This is especially true when you're analyzing communities that trade in grievance politics, conspiracy theories, and also calls to real-world violence. However, when I was conducting my research, I was seeking out engagement, meaning that I didn't go with the non-interventionalist approach. I did comment on threads and share posts and make a few posts of my own just to try to drive that engagement. Part 3. A Turn to the Right, the Rise of Online Fascism. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the far-right's digital resurgence. In recent months, and especially after the start of the new Trump administration, I've noticed an alarming increase in the amount of racism and vitriol in everyday online spaces. This drew me to investigate how these thoughts were growing from far-right spaces and bleeding out into regular online forums. Platforms like 4chan's, Poll, and X serve as incubators for far-right extremist ideologies. Many of these individuals claim that they are simply using edgy humor, yet this language evolves into radicalizing people inside a massive echo chamber. I've also noticed during this project that the mask of edgy humor has slipped, and now most of these feeds are filled with outright hatred. What many people already know about the far right is that, central to their movement is a nostalgia for an imagined past, a white, patriarchal, ethnically homogenous society that never really existed in the form that they've pictured in their minds. So young white men are kind of drawn to the idea that their fathers and grandfathers lived in these idealized spaces and lived these idealized lives, and that the individuals removing access to this imagined past, to this dream that they've always had, that they're living like their fathers and grandfathers, the people removing access to it are mostly black people, feminists, and Jews. This is where we see the grievance politics enter the picture. These communities construct themselves around perceived losses, loss of status, loss of culture, loss of identity, and imagine themselves as victims of liberalism, communism, feminism, and multiculturalism. Our job as ethnographers isn't to debunk these wild conspiracy theories, but to understand how these narratives function. Part 4. New Revelations, Gathering and Interpreting the Data. I'd like to walk through my entire process in going into the field, gathering data and interpreting that data. When I first imagined this project, I wanted to find members of the far right that I could interview and gain important insights from. We would swap messages and have correspondence, but an important piece of data I gathered early on is that personal connections are difficult to create in these online far-right spaces. Therefore, I was never able to score any interviews, any private messaging, nothing like that. However, I did gain important information while spending time on 4chan and X. I did try to find the far-right in other websites, but another important piece of data is that they were easiest to find on X and 4chan, and I had little luck on Reddit, Facebook, and Discord. Especially on Reddit, most of these far-right spaces have been banned or put on hold or are in quarantine, as they call it. And then on Facebook, it's difficult to just search for the far-right outright. The easiest space to find people was on X and 4chan. Poll is right there on the front page of 4chan. So for 3 sessions that each were 3 hours long, I created an alternate ego, searched out the far right online, and began posting, commenting, and sharing to see the results. Here are some of the things that I've found. As I said, there are a lot of grievance politics, but a big thing was that on 4chan, there was a lot of, you don't have real, racist street cred. People would accuse each other of not being legitimate neo-Nazis or legitimate white supremacists. That would be thrown around a lot on 4chan. And so it seemed almost like the racism on 4chan's poll was kind of like a meme. It wasn't as sincere, as strange as that sounds, as what I found on X. 4chan, of course, there was a lot of liberal use of the N-word, of slurs, of all kinds of things, and a lot of blame to be thrown around at different groups, a lot of grievances. And again, that makes sense to what we understand about the far right, about how fascism is, how fascism comes about, and people who get caught up in it, what their feelings are. And so there's that. There's, of course, always the grievances of financial situations, the grievances of romantic situations that they find themselves in, and stuff like that. And so, like I said, I wish I had found more websites, but on 4chan there was a lot of, there was a lot of, you're not racist enough. Show me your racism card. And that was always interesting. Some of the stuff I've discovered ties directly into the previously mentioned grievance politics, but even further than that, each time I went back into the field, I noticed a particular issue in that space that everyone was rallying behind. In visit one, in my first fieldwork visit, that first 3 hours, there was a black student that received a perfect score on an SAT. And there was a lot of, oh, how did he do it? He must have cheated. They must have just given him a perfect score because he was black, because of DEI and because of woke and stuff like that. In my second visit, what everyone was rallying around was the Netflix series Adolescence. And there was a lot of anger about how the series portrayed what happened and everything. It's important to understand that the series is completely fictional. It was written at a time before there was a stabbing that all of these groups are pointing to, of a young black man who stabbed a young white woman, and they were all saying, oh, like they race swapped the kid to make white people look bad. However, the show was not based on that incident. It was written completely fictionally, like from scratch. It wasn't a real story, but they had turned it into this thing that they'd race swapped because the liberal media is trying to make us look bad, trying to take us down. On the third visit, the thing that everyone was rallying around was the alleged killing of Austin Metcalf by Carmelo Anthony. And this story has become infamous because of the far right, and they basically were taking it as an opportunity to try to start a race war. Like, white people and black people cannot live in the same spaces without one of us ending up dead, and usually the white person in their eyes, and therefore we cannot occupy the same society, the same culture, and so, race war. So those were interesting. That was an interesting pattern I found. Every time I went back, there was a new thing that everyone was rallying behind. Another significant find that the vitriol on X was so extreme that I concluded that there's no way to continue to operate in these spaces without constructing a reality around oneself. So this was especially important in the research that I did. Is there's the beliefs were incredibly extreme, and it presented a worldview that cannot exist and share space with our own. So they were fabricating an entire new universe in order to uphold their beliefs. And I found this incredibly interesting. Most importantly, this idea that people of sub-Saharan African descent don't have IQs above 85. They believe the average IQ of someone in sub-Saharan Africa is between 70 and 75. This would make everyone in that entire region mentally underdeveloped, and therefore they couldn't possibly have a functioning society, which we know that they do. So this doesn't make any sense, especially if you step outside, if you look online in spaces outside of these, this simply isn't possible. And so there are more examples as well. They shared a picture of a mixed race individual who was special needs, and they came to the conclusion that all mixed race people are like this. You don't race mix because race mixing makes people that are all special needs. And again, this belief doesn't make any sense, because I'm sure they've seen mixed race people in media, in their everyday lives, walking around, going to the grocery store, going to school, going to work. And so you have to spend, I feel like, and I would have liked to have gone and done some kind of survey to see how much time these people spend online. You have to spend most of your time in these spaces to convince yourselves that these things are real. And so you have to construct an entirely new universe that doesn't actually exist in reality in order to stay in these spaces and stay this angry and aggrieved. And so I think I had one more example that I wanted to share that was an interesting pattern that I found. An interesting piece of data is every one of these far-right accounts would share videos of black people fighting in public. This is something they did all the time. So some accounts were completely dedicated to this practice of sharing videos of black people fighting each other or other groups in public. And every one of these accounts would share something like this at least once. And again, what they would say in every one of these posts is essentially like, oh, like, you literally can't allow black people to go out in public, otherwise they'll start fighting everybody. Like, they're all so angry and violent, like the instant they step outside their front doors, they're fighting everyone they see. And so, again, it's quite absurd. And a difficult part of going in these spaces and like trying to hold empathy for these individuals was how ridiculous some of their beliefs were. And, and that's, I'm sure it goes without saying, again, the N-word slurs were everywhere in these places. But some of these beliefs are so patently ridiculous that you wonder how it's possible for them to hold them, like, mentally. And again, I would have really liked to have done a survey to see how long the average person in these spaces spends online, how much time they spend online. But so that's just an interesting find that I found in doing this research. Now, finally, when it comes to conclusions I came to from the data that I gathered, I noticed that the supposed solutions to these problems for these individuals are necessarily impossible to manifest. The solution is getting rid of all black people, literally shipping everyone back to Africa. And then, there was some more genocidal language that I won't get into. And so their supposed solution is logistically impossible. So in order to solve all the problems in their lives, we have to get rid of woke, we have to get rid of DEI, but even deeper than that, we have to get rid of all black people in the whole country, every one of them, all 40 million, ship them all back to Africa. And the same goes for Europe. Have to get rid of every single, person of color that exists in Europe. Because the solution to their problem that they've come up with is impossible, then they will always have a grievance, and they will always have something to be angry about. And that, as strange as it sounds, that keeps them in these spaces and gives them a community. It necessitates a community that they can build relationships around and share in their anger and their grievances. And so that was the most interesting find, I thought. Part 5, Reflexivity and Researcher Safety. Researching online hate isn't just intellectually demanding, it's emotionally and ethically complex. While I was conducting this research, I had to ask myself, how is this affecting me? And how am I maintaining boundaries? Again, this wasn't easy to do as a black man who's lived under a white supremacist power structure my entire life, and who was the target of much of the vitriol that I observed while in these online spaces. As I mentioned earlier, to protect myself, I built anonymous online profiles and modeled myself after other far-right profiles that I'd seen. I had a new name, new personality, and new views that would helpfully endear me to others. I used Stable Diffusion to create a profile picture that I imagined that they would, that they would like. It's something I'd seen before. It was a Roman statue with an American flag in the background. Now, staying objective was difficult, but it was important for gathering data. It's important to not take things personally and to not judge the individuals that are saying heinous things online. What I did was constantly remind myself of my position as a researcher and to assess every situation accordingly. Part 6, Moving Forward. To finalize my thoughts, I wanted listeners to understand the importance and the relevance of this research. As the years have gone by, the internet has taken up more and more of our lives, to the point where there are generations that are being raised almost completely on the internet. Because of this growing online presence, I believe that more ethnographers need to adapt and become more proficient in methods like internet ethnography, digital ethnography, and netnography, as internet culture continues to grow and dominate the public consciousness. This particular research is relevant to anthropology because of both the growing presence of the far right and neo-Nazis online, and because of the lack of anthropological studies conducted on this particular issue. While I was conducting my fieldwork visits, I noticed a concerning pattern where dog whistles were abandoned in favor of racial slurs, outdated race science, and genocidal rhetoric. The animosity that drives the far right has become more blatant, hateful, and violent. Because people spend so much more of their time online now, these individuals don't just find themselves in echo chambers, they have constructed an entirely new reality that perfectly represents their worldview and drives them into a feedback loop of hatred and self-loathing. Hopefully, research like this can continue to shed light on how so many people are pulled into alt-right spaces online and possibly find a solution to breaking the cycle in the future. That's it for this episode of Digital Shadows. Thank you for listening and being receptive. I would like to disclose to listeners that ChatGPT assisted in the making of the script for this podcast. That was the extent of its use, just for the script of this podcast. I'd also like to remind listeners that this podcast was created as part of an ethnographic project for Dr. Marty Atanez's Fieldwork Methods class in the Anthropology Department at the University of Colorado, Denver. With special thanks to Marty Atanez and the Anthropology Department for allowing me to use their equipment to record this show. Thank you very much.